In 1962, millions of people sat in dark theaters and watched Peter O'Toole's Lawrence of Arabia open with a motorcycle tearing down an empty English country road. A few seconds later, that motorcycle swerves, throws its rider into the air, and the screen cuts to black. It is one of the most famous opening scenes in the history of cinema, and it lasts less than a minute. The film treats it as a footnote, a quick and tragic prologue before the real story begins in the deserts of Arabia. But that 30-second crash was not a footnote. It was one of the strangest, most contested deaths of the 20th century, and almost none of what actually happened made it onto the screen. There was a mystery vehicle at the scene that was never identified. There was a witness who stuck to his story under enormous pressure, was quietly transferred to the other side of the world, and took his own life 5 years later. There were whispers of British intelligence, of enemies made in the desert who never forgave him, of a cover-up that reached the highest levels of government, and buried underneath all of it was a piece of medical history so significant that it would go on to save millions of lives, including possibly yours, every single time you put on a helmet. This is the story the movie never told you. To understand why a British colonel's death on a country lane in Dorset became one of history's enduring mysteries, you have to understand who Thomas Edward Lawrence actually was, and more importantly, who he had become by 1935. During the First World War, Lawrence had helped lead the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, riding alongside Arab forces through the desert, blowing up railways, and becoming, almost against his will, one of the most famous men on earth. Newspapers turned him into a legend, governments treated him as a diplomatic asset, and Lawrence hated almost every second of it. He had gone to war believing in a promise that the Arab people fighting alongside Britain would receive their own independent homeland when it was over. That promise was broken, carved up instead by European powers who had never set foot in the desert he loved. Lawrence came home disillusioned, exhausted, and famous for a war he no longer wanted to be associated with. What he did next tells you almost everything about the man behind the legend. Instead of accepting a comfortable government post, a title, or a seat in the House of Lords, all of which were offered to him, Lawrence enlisted in the Royal Air Force as an ordinary aircraft man under a fake name. When journalists tracked him down and exposed him, he was discharged and enlisted again under yet another false identity, this time in the Royal Tank Corps, before eventually being allowed back into the RAF. He wanted more than anything to disappear into the ranks, to be nobody. But there was one part of his old life he refused to give up: speed, specifically motorcycles. And not just any motorcycle. Lawrence became one of the most devoted customers of a small, obsessive motorcycle manufacturer named George Brough, and the machine Brough built for him would become, quite literally, the last thing Lawrence of Arabia ever touched. The Brough Superior S100 was, in the early 1930s, the fastest production motorcycle a person could buy. George Brough hand-built each one, testing every single unit himself before it left the factory, and famously guaranteed that every SS100 he sold could exceed 100 miles per hour, an almost unthinkable claim for a road-going machine in that era. It cost around £170, at a time when that kind of money could buy a family a modest house. Lawrence didn't just buy one Brough Superior. He bought 7 of them across his lifetime, naming each one in succession, George I through George VII, and referring to his personal favorite as Bonerges, an old biblical name meaning sons of thunder. He wrote about riding these machines with a kind of reverence usually reserved for religion. In one surviving essay, later published after his death, Lawrence described the feeling of opening the throttle on an empty stretch of English road, the wind splitting around his head, the machine's engine note rising into what he called a shriek, his eyes narrowed to slits against the cold, rushing air. This was not a man who rode a motorcycle to get from place to place. This was a man chasing something. Some historians and biographers have speculated that after the trauma, humiliation, and disillusionment of his wartime experience, speed had become one of the only ways Lawrence could feel anything at all. Whether that reading is fair to him or not, what is certain is that by 1935, riding fast on his Brough Superior was one of the defining rituals of his daily life. The Brough Superior brand itself carried a reputation that went far beyond ordinary motorcycles. It was widely nicknamed the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles, a comparison that George Bruck actively encouraged, and Rolls-Royce itself never bothered to challenge, largely because Bruff's fit and finish genuinely rivaled it. Each machine was assembled twice, once to check every component fit correctly, then completely disassembled and rebuilt a second time for the customer, with the engine bench tested at full throttle before it ever touched a public road. For a man like Lawrence, who spent years trying to erase his own identity, disappearing into fake names and low ranks, there was something almost contradictory about his devotion to a machine engineered with that kind of obsessive, uncompromising precision. It was, in a strange way, the one part of his life he refused to make ordinary. On the 13th of May, 1935, Lawrence had just left the British Army camp at Bovington, riding his seventh and final Brough Superior back toward his small, isolated cottage at Clouds Hill, only a few miles away. He had recently and finally left military service for good after 12 years of trying to vanish into it. According to the official account that has stood for nearly a century, a dip in the narrow road blocked Lawrence's view of two boys riding bicycles ahead of him. He swerved hard to avoid hitting them, lost control of the powerful machine, and was thrown over the handlebars, landing headfirst on the road with catastrophic force. He was not wearing a helmet. At the time, in 1935, helmets simply were not something road riders wore in Britain. They were considered equipment for professional racers only, an accessory for the track, not for a colonel riding home on a Tuesday afternoon. Lawrence was rushed to the military hospital at Bovington Camp, unconscious, with severe skull fractures and catastrophic brain injuries. He never regained consciousness. 6 days later, on the 19th of May, 1935, Thomas Edward Lawrence died. He was 46 years old. That is the story the movie tells, more or less in about 30 cinematic seconds. And on the surface, it looks like a simple, tragic accident. But almost immediately, cracks started appearing in that simple version of events, cracks that the official inquest never fully closed, and that historians are still arguing about nearly 90 years later. And if you think a swerve to avoid two boys on bicycles is where this story ends, you are about to find out just how wrong that assumption is. Here is where it gets stranger. At the coroner's inquest into Lawrence's death, a soldier named Corporal Ernest Catchpole, who had been out walking near the road at the time, gave a statement that should have been a footnote and instead became the seed of a conspiracy theory that refuses to die. Catchpole testified that just before Lawrence swerved to avoid the two boys on bicycles, he saw a large black car traveling in the opposite direction, passing Lawrence's motorcycle moments before the crash. No such car was ever found. No driver ever came forward. It was never definitively linked to the accident in any official capacity, but Catchpole did not waver. According to multiple later investigations into the case, he stuck to his account of the black car, despite what has been described as significant pressure from military and government officials to change or soften his story. And then, in what true crime writers and historians alike have pointed to for decades as deeply suspicious, Corporal Catchpole was transferred away from his family, posted overseas to Cairo. In 1940, 5 years after Lawrence's death, Catchpole died by suicide. The two young cyclists Lawrence swerved to avoid were, according to some accounts, also encouraged to leave the area not long after the crash. To this day, nobody has ever conclusively identified the black car or explained why a routine road accident produced a witness who was quietly relocated to another continent. Naturally, this vacuum of hard answers got filled with theories, some more credible than others. Lawrence, by 1935, was not simply a retired war hero fixing motorcycles in a cottage. Even in his supposed obscurity, he remained one of the most connected and closely watched men in Britain. He had reportedly been in contact with Arab leaders, including King Faisal, about the broken promises of the Balfour Declaration and the possibility of renewed unrest in the Middle East. There were claims, later disputed by many serious historians, that Lawrence had also had contact with Oswald Mosley's fascist Blackshirts movement, though Lawrence himself, in surviving letters, appears to have flatly rejected any association with them. There was speculation that British intelligence services viewed him as either an asset who needed protecting or a liability who knew far too much about promises made and broken in the Middle East. None of these theories have ever been proven. Respected Lawrence scholars, the historians who have spent entire careers studying his life and letters, are largely skeptical of the assassination theories. and point out that a simple road accident, with a stretch of blind road and 2 children on bicycles, is a far more mundane and statistically likely explanation than a state-sponsored killing. But the black car was real. Catchpole's testimony was real. His transfer and eventual suicide were real. And nearly 90 years later, filmmakers and authors are still making documentaries and writing entire books built around a single, unanswered question: was it really just an accident? Winston Churchill, who knew Lawrence personally and respected him enormously, attended his funeral and later called him one of the greatest beings alive in that era. The funeral drew statesmen, military officers, and writers, a final, almost cinematic gathering for a man who had spent the last decade of his life trying to disappear from public view. It is a strange, quiet irony that a man who enlisted under fake names, specifically to avoid being recognized, ended up with a death so mysterious that people are still trying to identify him, or rather, identify the black car, generations later. But here is the part of the story that the movie really left out entirely. The part that has nothing to do with conspiracy theories and everything to do with the ground Lawrence's head actually struck that day. Among the doctors who treated Lawrence in his final 6 days was a young Australian neurosurgeon named Hugh Cairns. Cairns had trained under some of the most respected surgeons in the world, and when Lawrence was brought in with catastrophic, unprotected head trauma, Cairns watched him decline over 6 agonizing days without ever being able to intervene in a meaningful way. According to Cairns's own later writings, he became convinced that if Lawrence had simply been wearing a protective helmet that day, the impact might not have been fatal at all. This idea did not leave Cairns. It followed him for years. At the start of the Second World War, Army dispatch riders, the soldiers whose entire job was to race motorcycles across battlefields carrying urgent messages, were dying from head injuries at an alarming rate. In 1941, Cairns published a report in the British Medical Journal revealing that over 2,000 motorcyclists had already died on British roads in the first 21 months of the war alone, a staggering figure, higher even than the equivalent period before the war, despite far less civilian traffic. Cairns, along with a colleague, went as far as constructing crude models of the human skull and brain out of gelatin and formaldehyde, to physically demonstrate how the brain moves and strikes the inside of the skull during a high-speed impact, essentially inventing some of the earliest experimental crash science in medical history. His research was blunt and unambiguous. Helmets saved lives, full stop. The British Army was convinced. In November of 1941, just months after Cairns's report, crash helmets became compulsory for all British Army motorcyclists on duty, a direct, traceable line running from Lawrence's bare head hitting a Dorset road in 1935 to steel and leather helmets on the heads of thousands of soldiers just 6 years later. Civilian riders in Britain would have to wait far longer. Helmets did not become legally mandatory for all motorcyclists on UK roads until 1973. Nearly 40 years after Lawrence's death, and decades after Cairns himself had passed away without ever seeing his life's work fully written into law. But the foundation, the data, the science, the entire modern understanding of why a motorcyclist's head needs protection traces directly back to a Nuffield surgeon staring at Lawrence's fractured skull in a military hospital in 1935 and refusing to let the loss be meaningless. Think about that for a second. Every single time a rider anywhere in the world clips a helmet strap under their chin before pulling out of a driveway, there is a direct, documented, traceable line connecting that small, ordinary safety habit back to one specific afternoon on one specific road in Dorset, England, and one specific machine, Brough Superior S000 registration number GW2275. The Brough Superior itself, remarkably, survived the crash largely intact and was sent back to George Brough's factory to be repaired. It changed hands multiple times over the following decades, eventually passing to a reclusive private collector who reportedly kept it in his living room for years. The machine that indirectly saved millions of lives through the research it inspired has spent most of its existence sitting quietly out of public view, a piece of engineering history most people have never heard of, despite what it set into motion. David Lean's 1962 film gives you the crash. It gives you the tragedy, the scale. The myth of Lawrence of Arabia crumbling in an instant on an empty road. What it does not give you is the black car nobody could ever trace. It does not give you Corporal Catchpole, a man whose testimony may have cost him everything, right down to his own life. It does not give you the whispers of intelligence services and broken political promises that turned a war hero's quiet retirement into a live wire nobody in power was entirely comfortable with, and it absolutely does not give you Hugh Cairns, the young surgeon standing beside Lawrence's hospital bed, who turned personal grief into decades of research that quietly reshaped motorcycle safety for the entire world. The movie shows you 30 seconds of tragedy. The real story took 30 years to finish playing out, and in many ways, through every helmet law on the books today, it is still playing out right now. So the next time you see the opening of Lawrence of Arabia, that quick, almost throwaway crash before the desert and the legend take over, remember what is actually sitting underneath those 30 seconds of film? A mystery car that was never found. A witness who paid an unbearable price for refusing to change his story. A world of intelligence, politics, and broken promises that may or may not have caught up with one man on a quiet English road. And a young surgeon standing at a hospital bed who turned his own helplessness into a research program that has been protecting riders for generations, most of whom have never heard his name. That is the part Lawrence of Arabia left out. And it might be the most important part of the whole story.